Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice. 100 small choices, not reckless choices, not irrational ones. The kind anyone could make on an ordinary Tuesday. In good weather, wearing sensible shoes, one more photo, one more bend in the trail, one more assumption that the path ahead can't be much different from the one behind. The wilderness doesn't need cliffs or blizzards to kill you. It doesn't need avalanches or lightning or a fall from a great height. Sometimes it only needs you to believe that because other people came back, you will too. That belief is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It simply sits in the back of the mind, unexamined while the legs keep moving forward. Dense forest swallows landmarks. Afternoon rain erases tracks within minutes. Rivers rewrite the landscape overnight. Moving stones, deepening channels, turning yesterday's crossing into today's obstacle. And by the time you realize you're no longer taking a hike, you're surviving one, the decisions that mattered are already behind you, already spent, already unavailable to you. Nature never hurried. It never needed to. It simply waited, patient in the way that only something indifferent can be patient, for the small accumulation of ordinary choices to do the work it never had to do itself. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. Chris Krimmers was 21 years old. Lisanne Froon was 22. Both were Dutch students, both far from the flat, familiar geography of home, spending the early months of 2014 traveling through Central America the way so many young travelers do. Loosely planned, open-ended, filling their days with volunteer work and short excursions between longer stretches of study and rest. They had settled for a time near the town of Boquete, in the highlands of Panama, a place known among backpackers for its cool climate, its coffee farms, and its easy access to trails that promise big views for relatively little effort. April 1st, 2014 was supposed to be nothing extraordinary, a day hike, the El Pianista Trail, a walk so well known, so thoroughly documented in guidebooks and travel forums and casual conversation between hostel guests that choosing it barely registered as a decision at all. It was the obvious hike, the one everybody did, the one people recommended to other people without a second thought, because nothing had ever gone wrong on it that anyone talked about. That was the danger, if a danger can be said to exist before it ever announces itself. Not the trail itself, but its reputation. Thousands of hikers had walked El Pianista and returned exactly as they left. Sunburned, satisfied, scrolling through their photos on the walk back into town. Each one of those safe returns quietly reinforced a kind of collective, unspoken permission. This trail has already been tamed. This trail has already had its risk priced out of it by everyone who came before you. Nobody tells you the terrain doesn't know how many people walked it safely last month. The terrain only knows what is in front of it today. The rain that fell an hour ago, the fog rolling down from higher ground, the stream that was ankle deep at dawn and will not stay that way by early afternoon. For Chris Krimmers and Lisanne Froon, their afternoon hike would become their last. Nothing about the morning suggested that. Nothing in the pictures, nothing in the pace, nothing in the ordinary rhythm of two friends setting out with day packs and cameras, and no particular sense of urgency. The greatest danger that day was never the trail they planned to hike. It was the one they didn't realize they were entering, one step at a time, without a single moment that felt like a turning point. El Pianista climbed steadily upward through farmland and forest toward a viewpoint locals call the Mirador, sitting at roughly 1,850 meters above sea level, about 6,070 feet, high enough to leave the warmth of the valley floor behind and enter cooler, wetter air. For most visitors, that viewpoint is the entire destination. They arrive. They take in the view, the valley spread out below, the ridgelines fading into haze, the kind of vista that justifies the climb entirely on its own. They take their photographs, and then they turn around satisfied and walk back down the way they came. The trail, as far as the guidebooks and the travel blogs and the secondhand recommendations were concerned, ended there. That was the story everyone told about El Pianista. That was a story that made it feel safe. But the mountain itself told a different story, one that had nothing to do with what the tourists believed about it. Beyond the Mirador, the terrain changes character entirely, and it changes quickly. The manicured, well-trodden tourist path gives way to cloud forest. Dense, perpetually damp, disorienting in a way that flat, familiar terrain never prepares a person for. River valleys cut through the slopes at odd angles. Livestock trails worn by cattle rather than hikers branch off in directions that lead nowhere a tourist would want to go, and look, at a glance, exactly as legitimate as the real route. Jungle tracks fork and double back on themselves beneath a canopy thick enough to blur the position of the sun. On social media, El Pianista was a scenic viewpoint. It was the postcard shot, the caption-worthy overlook, the single frame that made the whole hike look effortless and complete. What the photographs never showed, because nobody stayed long enough to photograph it, was what came after the overlook. The part of the mountain with no view, no signage, and no forgiveness for a wrong turn. The environmental hazards beyond the Mirador were not exotic or rare. They were the same hazards that quietly claim hikers all over the world, every year in places that never make international news. Afternoon rain arrived on a near daily schedule in that region, as predictable as a clock, and it turned exposed trail surfaces to slick, unstable clay within minutes of the first drops. Fog rolled in low and fast, swallowing sightlines, swallowing landmarks, swallowing the confident sense of direction a hiker carries when the sky is still clear. Streams that looked shallow and calm in the morning ran faster, colder, and higher by mid-afternoon, fed by rain falling higher up the slope long before it reached the people walking below. And above it all sat a canopy so thick, so continuous, that even a helicopter passing directly overhead might never catch sight of a person standing beneath it, waving, calling out, entirely invisible from 10 meters up. Local guides had long understood what casual hikers often didn't, because understanding it was the entire basis of their work, that the trail beyond the summit was not for the inexperienced, and not for anyone without someone who already knew the route by memory rather than by map. Whether that understanding existed as formal warning signage in 2014 is less certain than the caution itself, which was real and which traveled the way real warnings so often do among people who live beside a landscape rather than visit it, hiker to hiker, guide to guide, informally, easy for an outsider passing through for a few weeks to miss entirely. The trail itself never forced a fatal mistake on anyone. It only kept offering opportunities to make one, quietly, without any signal that this particular opportunity mattered more than the last. What is known about the afternoon comes from fragments, photographs, timestamps, phone records, later pieced together the way a story is so often reconstructed only once it has already ended badly by people working backward from an outcome nobody wanted to reach. The early images were unremarkable. Two young women smiling, the trail beneath them ordinary and sunlit, the kind of photographs that could have come from any hike, anywhere, on any given weekend. Normal daytime photographs, the kind taken on 100 other outings that ended without incident and were forgotten within the week. Then the photographs continued past the point where they should have stopped, past the Mirador, past the place where the well-worn, forgiving tourist trail gave way to something far less defined, far less forgiving, and far less documented. The final daylight images were taken on the far sides of the divide, as in terrain that no casual hiker's mental map, however confident, would have adequately described in advance. By later that same afternoon, the first emergency call had already been placed. That single detail carries more weight than it might first appear to. Something had already gone wrong, and gone wrong quickly, within a matter of hours, on a hike that should have taken an afternoon and nothing more than an afternoon. The evidence recovered afterward painted a picture of preparation calibrated precisely for a short, low-risk outing, because that is exactly what the hike had been sold as, by reputation, by convention, by the sheer number of people who had done it before without incident. There was no satellite beacon among the recovered belongings, no wilderness survival equipment, limited food, limited water, casual day hike gear. It suited perfectly well to a scenic overlook and a walk back down, and suited very poorly to an unplanned night spent exposed in cloud forests. And the timing of the day's start, reconstructed from the available evidence, left only a narrow window of daylight for anything beyond the planned familiar route. A thin margin that evaporated entirely the moment the hike extended further than intended. Then there were the phones, repeated attempts to call for help, logged and later recovered. Careful, deliberate battery conservation between those attempts. The phone switched on only in brief windows, checked for a signal that rarely came, then powered back down again to preserve whatever charge remained for the next attempt. That pattern is not the behavior of panic. It is the behavior of two people trying, with clear-eyed method, to survive a situation that had already outgrown their preparation for it. Each individual decision, examined on its own and in isolation, looked entirely reasonable. Continuing a little further to see what lay past the viewpoint everyone talked about, not carrying gear for an overnight stay on what was billed by every account available to them as a simple day hike, believing that a phone saved carefully enough might eventually catch a signal if held in reserve for the right moment. None of these choices was reckless when considered on its own terms. But stacked together, one after another, they quietly removed every safety margin the mountain might otherwise have granted to prepared, cautious hikers. By the time the phones became their only connection to the outside world, rescue was already becoming a race against biology instead of distance. A race measured not in kilometers to be closed, but in hours the body had left to give. What happens to the human body once it becomes lost in unforgiving terrain follows a grimly predictable sequence. Not speculation, but documented physiology, repeated in case after case across very different landscapes. First comes the stress response, elevated heart rate, a surge of adrenaline, a narrowing of attention that can make sound decisions harder to reach exactly when they matter most. The mind, under that kind of pressure, tends to fixate on the last known landmark, on the belief that the trail must be just ahead, just around the next bend, rather than step back and reassess. Then dehydration sets in, slow and cumulative, worsened by physical exertion and by a tropical climate that pulls moisture from the body, even when the surrounding air feels heavy and wet with rain. Fatigue follows close behind, and with fatigue, judgment continues to decline. The very faculty most needed to solve the problem of being lost begins to erode at precisely the moment it is needed most. Whether an injury immobilized either woman at some point during the ordeal remains unconfirmed. No definitive injury mechanism was ever established by investigators, and none should be assumed here. But injury or not, the terrain alone, the slick clay, the fast water, the featureless understory, was more than sufficient to trap two exhausted, disoriented people far past the point where an easy return was still possible. It is a common misconception that hypothermia belongs only to snow, ice, and freezing temperatures. It does not. Tropical cloud forests can produce it just as effectively and often more quickly than people expect. Constant rain saturates clothing completely. Wet fabric strips heat from the body many times faster than dry air ever could, even in conditions that would feel merely cool, even mild to someone standing still and dry. Add wind, add hours of exhausting, difficult movement, add the kind of overnight temperature drop that is entirely ordinary at that elevation, and a body already weakened by dehydration and stress can lose its fight against the cold in a place most people would never think to fear as cold at all. Then there are the photographs, the detail that would come to define this case in the public imagination more than any other single piece of evidence. More than 90 flash images captured during a single night, taken in darkness, in terrain that offered nothing recognizable, nothing scenic, nothing worth photographing under ordinary circumstances. No confirmed explanation has ever been established for why so many images were taken in those conditions. Perhaps an attempt to signal searchers who might be scanning the darkness from a distance. Perhaps an effort to illuminate the ground underfoot one uncertain step at a time. Perhaps simply the same instinct that makes a person reach for a phone in almost any crisis. To record, to make sense of, to leave some trace behind, even without a clear plan for who might eventually see it. No definitive conclusion has ever been reached about those images, and none is offered here. What can be said, based on everything the investigation gathered, is this. Wilderness deaths are rarely the result of one single catastrophic event, one dramatic fall, one sudden storm. They are almost always the result of several manageable problems, each survivable entirely on its own, compounding quietly until together they no longer are. Long before anyone found physical evidence of where the two women had actually been, rescuers were already searching, in good faith and with real urgency, where they only hoped the women still were. The search that followed was extensive, carefully coordinated, and ultimately painfully slow to produce any conclusive answers. Panamanian authorities led the initial effort, mobilizing search teams into terrain that even trained personnel found difficult to navigate. Dutch investigators representing the families and coordinating internationally joined not long after, adding resources and attention that a smaller, more remote case might never have received. Local guides, the same people who understood the terrain beyond the Mirador better than any official map ever could, were brought in to search ground that outside search teams could not safely cover alone. Indigenous volunteers with generations of familiarity with the region searched as well, often covering territory that no outsider would have known existed. Helicopters passed overhead again and again, hindered every time by the same dense canopy that had swallowed the two hikers from view in the first place. Search dogs worked the ground below, following scent through terrain that shifted with every rainfall. Chris and Lizanne had been reported missing after failing to return when expected, and the search that followed stretched on for weeks without a conclusive break, weeks in which hope and probability slowly, painfully diverged from one another. The first significant discovery came months later. In June of 2014, a backpack was recovered, found downstream along a riverbank, far from the Mirador and far from where anyone had expected to find anything at all. Inside were the kinds of ordinary belongings that make a tragedy suddenly, unbearably concrete. Phones, a camera, passports, sunglasses, money, untouched, left exactly as they had been when the backpack was lost, set down, or swept away by rising water. Human remains were recovered afterward, scattered downstream across multiple separate locations, a pattern consistent with a body or bodies carried and redistributed by moving water over an extended period of time, rather than a single contained scene that might have offered investigators a clearer, more immediate account of what had happened. The official findings, painstaking and deliberately cautious in their language, documented what the phone logs had already strongly suggested: repeated attempts to call for emergency help, made under circumstances of increasing desperation as the hours passed. Investigators found no conclusive evidence of third-party involvement in the case. The most probable account, consistent with the terrain, the timeline, and the physical evidence recovered, points to an accidental loss of the trail in difficult terrain, followed by exposure and injury. Though the precise sequence of events, the exact order in which things went wrong, was never established with full certainty. Investigators were working, as they so often must in cases like this one, from fragments rather than from certainty, from evidence that could support a probable story but never quite complete it. What the case left behind was not closure so much as a legacy. International attention brought new scrutiny to a stretch of trail that had, until then, existed largely within local knowledge alone, discussed among guides and residents but rarely written down for outsider to read. Guides in the region became more explicit, more insistent, about exactly where the tourist trail ended and where genuine risk began, drawing a line in conversation that had once been left implicit. And online, the debate never fully quieted, theories multiplying in the absence of absolute certainty, even as the physical evidence pointed, again and again, back toward the same quiet, unglamorous conclusion. Two people who wandered further than they meant to, into terrain that did not care how prepared, how careful, or how experienced they were. The mystery captured the world's attention, but the lesson had been written long before the investigation ever began. This story didn't begin with a disaster. It began with a decision to keep walking, then another, each one small enough to feel inconsequential in the moment it was made. The chain could have broken at almost any point along the way, turning around at the Mirador, where the maintained, forgiving trail ended, and the real risk quietly began, carrying enough supplies for an unexpected night outdoors, in case an afternoon hike somehow became something longer than planned, bringing a satellite emergency beacon so that a call for help did not depend entirely on a cellular signal that might never arrive in terrain like that, hiking with someone who already knew the terrain beyond the summit by memory, rather than trusting that the path would simply explain itself as it went, leaving behind a detailed route and an expected turnaround time with someone back in town, so that when the hours slipped past without a return, someone would know precisely where to start looking and how much time had already been lost. None of those choices would have guaranteed survival. The wilderness offers no guarantees to anyone, however careful, however experienced, however well equipped. But together, those choices would have dramatically improved the odds that on that particular afternoon in April were never given the chance to matter, because the choices that would have created them were never made. Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were not thrill seekers chasing impossible risk for its own sake. They were young travelers on what should have been an unremarkable afternoon hike, the kind completed safely by countless others before them and countless others since. That is precisely what makes this case endure the way it has. The circumstances were extraordinary. The decisions that led to them were painfully ordinary. The same decisions countless people continue to make every single year on trails that look familiar and safe right up until the exact moment they no longer are. The wilderness never hated them. It never hunted them. It has no interest in either. It simply gave them fewer chances than they realized it would, one decision at a time, and it never once announced which decision was the one that mattered most. You will stand at your own version of that overlook one day. The trail will look finished, the view will look like the reward you came for, and something beyond it will look, for just a moment, like it's calling you a little further. Check the forecast before you go. Tell someone exactly where you're going and exactly when you expect to be back. Carry more than you think you'll need, even for a short walk. Turn around when the marked trail ends, even if the light is still good and your legs still feel strong, and the view ahead looks like it might be worth it, because the mountain does not know your plans, and it will not adjust itself for your confidence. It was never cruel to Chris Kremers and Liz Froon. It was only ever indifferent. And indifference has never once made an exception for someone who simply assumed they'd be fine. None of this had to happen. Every choice that led here could have gone another way, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.